Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place, so stick with us. Now, recently, I was in New York at the legendary Birdland Jazz Club, and I had such an amazing time. Experiencing jazz live there was so incredible. Just watching the musicians improvise, it's almost like seeing their thoughts play out in real time. Every note, every pause, every kind of subtle interaction just feels like a conversation literally unfolding right before your eyes. And it made me think not just about their skill, but what jazz can actually teach us about creativity, freedom, and expression. And at the same time, I've been listening on repeat to Ray's new album, and I just love how she weaves jazz and blues influences into pop. It's so fresh, so unique, and this reminder that jazz isn't just history. It's still alive, it's evolving, and continuing to influence music today as it stands. So today, I want to explore jazz from all different angles. Its rich history, the psychology behind improvisation, what's happening in the brain, and even why listening to jazz can boost your creativity, focus, and emotional well-being. So whether you're a musician, a listener, or just curious about the magic of jazz, this episode is for you. So let's start off with the history of jazz, because I think to really understand the psychology behind it, we need to start off by understanding where it comes from. So jazz originated in African American communities in New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th century. But its roots go even deeper than that. It's the result of this powerful blending of African and European musical traditions, all shaped by history, migration, and lived experience. From African musical traditions, jazz inherits things like complex rhythms, improvisation, and call and response. These were central features of music brought over during the transatlantic slave trade, where music became one of the few ways enslaved people could preserve culture, communicate with one another, and express emotion. And there's a strong emphasis on rhythm, on the body, and participation. Music wasn't just something that you listened to, it was something that you physically did. Then, from the European traditions, jazz takes elements like harmony, chord structures, and formal instrumentation, things like brass instruments and the piano. And in places like New Orleans, these influences came together in a really unique way. It was this cultural melting pot where African, Caribbean, and European sounds were just constantly interacting. But you also had the influence of blues and spirituals, genres that were rooted in hardship, resilience, and emotional expression. The blues, in particular, really introduced that deep sense of feeling and individuality that we now so strongly associate with jazz. And one of the most important elements that carried through all of this is something called call and response. Now, call and response is essentially a musical conversation. One phrase is played or sung, and another responds. And psychologically, this is really important because it reflects something deeply human, which is our instinct to communicate and to connect with one another. And even before jazz became what we recognize as jazz today, it was already rooted in this interaction, expression, and shared experience. But jazz also became a way of telling stories, not always through lyrics, but through sound, timing, phrasing, and emotion. And this is where the psychological framing becomes really powerful, because jazz isn't just a genre of music, it's a form of expression, identity, and freedom. Especially when you consider the historical context as well. For many Black musicians at the time, jazz became a space where they could express individuality in a world that often denied it. So, improvisation, one of the defining features of jazz, wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was personal and emotion. And in many ways, it was this form of autonomy as well. And that brings us to one of the most important ideas in understanding jazz. It's not chaos, how some people may describe it, but it's more like controlled spontaneity. See, jazz exists in this really interesting balance between structure and freedom. On one hand, you have structure. You've got chord progressions, rhythm, tempo, and musical form, of course. And these are the rules in which jazz is built around. But within those rules, musicians are free to improvise. So when you listen to a jazz solo, it might sound completely free and unpredictable, but it's not random, actually. The musician is creating within constraints. And this is something that's really interesting, again, from a psychological perspective, because research actually shows that constraints can enhance creativity rather than limit it. So when the brain has some kind of structure to work within, it's better able to explore, combine ideas, and actually generate something new. Too much freedom can actually be overwhelming, but the right amount of constraint creates this kind of creative playground. And jazz is the perfect example of that. Now, this leads into this other common misconception that jazz improvisation is just making things up on the spot from nothing. But that's not actually how it works. See, jazz musicians build what's often referred to as a vocabulary over time. And these are patterns, phrases, musical ideas, sometimes called licks, actually, that they've practiced, internalized, and stored in their memory. And there's research suggesting that musicians don't just store these as abstract sounds, but as linked audio and motor patterns. So it's not just about knowing what a phrase sounds like, it's also about knowing how it feels to play it. The sound and the physical movement are connected in the brain. So when a musician is improvising, they're not pulling ideas out of nowhere. They're drawing from this internal library, adapting it, reshaping it, and responding to what's happening in the moment. Now, a really helpful way to think about this is language itself. When we speak, we're not inventing words from scratch, right? We're using vocabulary that we already know. But we're still able to create these completely new sentences, express new ideas, and respond in real time. And jazz works in exactly the same way. So at its core, jazz isn't random. It's what we might call trained spontaneity. It's the result of deep knowledge, practice, and experience combined with this remarkable ability to just let go and create in the moment. And that balance between structure and freedom and between this kind of knowledge and spontaneity is what makes jazz such a powerful window into how creativity actually works. Now, I want to move into something that sits at the heart of why jazz feels so powerful, and that's emotion and expression. Because when we talk about music, we often focus on what is being played. But in jazz, what really matters is how those notes are played. So two musicians can play the exact same melody, the exact same notes, and it can feel completely different. One might sound soft and reflective, almost a bit fragile. And the other might sound tense, urgent, or even a bit chaotic. And that difference comes down to expression. Things like timing, dynamics, phrasing, and even these subtle variations in pitch. And this is really important because it shows us that music isn't just this sequence of sounds. It's a carrier of emotional information. And there's actually research showing that when musicians improvise, their emotional intent actually shapes the way that their brain generates music in real time. So it's not just that they're playing and then adding emotion as an afterthought. The emotion is embedded in the creative process itself. The brain is essentially translating feeling into sound as it happens. And this is where jazz becomes this amazing form of emotional storytelling. When a jazz musician improvises, they're not just thinking about scales or technique. They're responding to how they feel in that moment, to what the other musicians are doing, and to the energy in the room. It's so dynamic and constantly evolving. In a way, it's almost like listening to someone think out loud, but instead of words, it's music. And that's why jazz can feel so expressive, even without lyrics present, because you're not just hearing this finished, polished piece, you're literally hearing the process, which is what makes it so unique. You're hearing all these decisions being made in real time. It's all unfolding in real time as it happens, which is pretty incredible. But there's also a really interesting connection here to how we as listeners perceive emotion in music. So some studies in music psychology suggest that we're highly sensitive to these expressive cues, things like timing, intensity, and variation. Our brains are constantly interpreting them, almost like we're decoding these emotional signals. So when a jazz musician stretches a note slightly, or delays a phrase, or even plays with this kind of unexpected intensity, we really feel it in that moment. It creates this sense of anticipation and emotional depth. And because improvisation happens in real time, that emotional input is constantly changing. It's not fixed or rehearsed in the same way. It's responsive. And I think that's why jazz often feels a bit more human and more alive. And I think that a really beautiful way to kind of think about it is when you listen to jazz, you're not just hearing music, you're really hearing someone think and feel at the same time, which is just what makes it so, so great. Now, let's get into what's actually happening in the brain during jazz improvisation, because this is where things get really fascinating. One of the reasons that jazz is so widely studied in neuroscience is because it gives us this rare opportunity to observe creativity in real time. Most creative processes, I would say, are quite slow and reflective, quite difficult to capture. But jazz improvisation happens instantly. You've got this decision after decision, moment by moment, just making it one of the best models that we have for understanding how the brain creates. So research using brain imaging, including fMRI studies, shows that when musicians improvise, there is this clear shift in brain activity. Multiple networks become engaged at once, working together to support this real-time creativity. So first off, there is increased activity in the brain's reward system, areas linked to dopamine, pleasure, and motivation. And this suggests that improvisation isn't just cognitively demanding, but it's also intrinsically rewarding. So, in other words, the act of creating in the moment actually feels good. And this aligns with what many musicians describe, that improvisation isn't just technical, it's enjoyable, even addictive. The brain is essentially reinforcing the behavior as it happens. And at the same time, you see strong activation in auditory and motor regions of the brain. This makes sense, given that improvisation requires this really tight connection between what you hear and what you play. The musician is constantly predicting sounds, producing them, and adjusting in real time. It's this continuous loop of hear, play, respond, and it's happening almost instantly. And there's also involvement of something called the salience network, which helps the brain decide what's important in the moment. And during improvisation, this network is constantly filtering information, what the other musicians are doing, what just happened musically, what might come next, and directing attention accordingly. So the brain isn't just creating in this moment, it's also selecting, prioritizing, and adapting all at the same time. But what's particularly interesting is how the brain changes as improvisation becomes more free. So research shows that when musicians move into more unconstrained improvisation, their playing becomes more novel and unpredictable. So Basically, in scientific terms, there's an increase in something called entropy, which essentially reflects how varied and less predictable the music is. And alongside that, the brain shifts into a more kind of exploratory mode. So instead of relying on familiar, repeated patterns, it starts generating more variation, more risk, and experimentation. It becomes less about staying within what's known and more about discovering something completely new. Now, this is super important to consider from a psychological perspective because it really shows that creativity isn't just this personality trait, it's literally a brain state. When the conditions are right, so when there's enough kind of structure to guide you, like I said, but also enough freedom to explore, the brain becomes more flexible and open and more willing to take creative risks. And jazz sits perfectly in that space. It provides just enough constraint to anchor the musician, but enough freedom to push boundaries. And as a result, the brain shifts away from this rigid, controlled processing into something a lot more fluid and exploratory. So, the key takeaway here is that during jazz improvisation, the brain isn't just making music, it's entering a state that's optimized for creativity. So, now we know what's happening inside the brain. Let's see how that feels from a musician's perspective. So, now I want to touch on something that really brings all of this together, and that's the idea of flow state, or what it feels like to completely lose yourself in music. Now, flow is a psychological state that's often described as being in the zone. It's when your focus becomes effortless. You're fully immersed in what you're doing and everything else just kind of fades away. You're not overthinking or second guessing, you're just doing whatever it might be in that moment. And people often describe a sense of time distortion in flow as well. Minutes can really feel like seconds or the opposite. You lose track of time because your attention is so deeply absorbed in the present moment. Now, this concept was first studied by psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, a big mouthful of a name, I'm telling you that. But he found that flow tends to happen when there's a balance between challenge and skill. So something is difficult enough to engage you, but not so difficult that it overwhelms you. And if you think about jazz improvisation, it fits perfectly into that framework. Jazz musicians are constantly operating at that edge where they have enough skill and knowledge to navigate the structure, but enough uncertainty to keep things challenging. They don't fully know what they're going to play next, and that's exactly what pulls them into the moment. And research shows that during improvisation, the brain actually changes in a way that supports this flow state. One of the most well-known findings is a reduction in activity in parts of the prefrontal cortex, which are associated with self-monitoring and self-criticism. And this is sometimes referred to as transient hyperfrontality. Essentially, the brain quiets down the areas responsible for evaluating and judging your own actions. And at the same time, there's increased activity in regions linked to spontaneous generation and self-expression. So what you get is this really interesting shift. The inner critic becomes quieter, and the creative output becomes more fluid. And this is such an important insight because it helps explain something a lot of us experience even outside of music. Overthinking tends to block creativity. When you're constantly analyzing, judging, or trying to get something right, even when you're, trying to start a new project, for example, you interrupt the natural flow of ideas. You become more rigid, more cautious, and less willing to take risks. But when you're in that flow state, that pressure really just disappears. And this is what often allows musicians to play their most expressive, most creative ideas. They're not stopping to question every note. They're really just trusting their training, their instincts, and the moment. And you can often hear when it happens as well. There's this certain kind of effortlessness to it. A sense that the music is just unfolding naturally rather than being forced. And what's also interesting is that flow isn't just about the individual as well, it can become shared. In group improvisation, musicians can enter this kind of collective flow where they're all locked into the same moment, responding to each other almost intuitively. And research on musical interactions suggests that this involves high levels of synchronization, prediction, and mutual attention, almost like the group is functioning as this single system. And again, this brings us back to that idea of jazz as conversation. But in flow, it's a conversation without hesitation. It's immediate, instinctive, and deeply connected. So when we talk about losing yourself in music, it's not just a metaphor, it's something that's actually happening in the brain. And maybe the most relatable takeaway from all of this is that the moments where you feel the most creative and expressive, the most in what you're doing, are often the moments where you've just stopped trying so hard to control everything. Because sometimes the best thing that you can do for creativity is just to get out of your own way. And I think we can all relate to that at some point. Now, one other element is something that I talk about a lot over here on the Soundline, and that's our brain's love for predicting the next move, predicting what's going to happen next. Our brains are constantly doing it, and especially in music. This means anticipating the next note, the next chord, the next rhythm, and when those predictions are met, it feels satisfying. But when they're slightly violated, when something unexpected happens, it creates this element of surprise. And that balance between expectation and surprise is a huge part of why jazz feels so engaging. Jazz often sets up these patterns, whether they're rhythmic, melodic, or harmonic, and then just gently disrupts them. A note might come earlier than expected. A phrase stretches a little bit longer, or a harmony shifts in this unexpected way. And research in music cognition shows that this balance is key to enjoyment. The brain doesn't want complete predictability. That becomes boring. But it also doesn't want complete randomness because that just becomes totally overwhelming. But what it enjoys most is something in between. Familiar enough to follow, but unpredictable enough to stay interesting. And jazz ticks all of those boxes. In fact, research shows that as improvisation increases, so does unpredictability. So, as I mentioned, this entropy element earlier, which reflects how varied and less predictable the music becomes. But crucially, this unpredictability isn't chaotic. It's still structured, like I said, so the brain stays engaged. It keeps updating its predictions and adjusting its expectations and responding to this new information. And this constant loop that we're in is what keeps us hooked. It's why jazz can feel so stimulating and even a little bit addictive to listen to as well, because your brain isn't just passively hearing it, it's actively participating in that moment, trying to figure out what's coming next. So when you pull it all together, jazz becomes more than just music. It becomes this conversation built on connection and empathy. I would say it's really a playground for the brain, just constantly balancing what it expects with what it discovers. And that's what keeps it endlessly engaging. And finally, I want to bring all of this into a section that's really relevant for everyone listening, because it's not just musicians who benefit from jazz. Listening to jazz itself has a host of cognitive, emotional, and even social benefits. So let's get into a few of those, starting off with the cognitive. First, there's the brain. And jazz is complex, as we've established. Its rhythms, harmonies, and improvisations all create patterns that are both familiar and unpredictable. And research shows that engaging with complex music like jazz can actually enhance attention, pattern recognition, and cognitive flexibility. I think that this is more relevant now than ever because we engage with so much short form content. we know for a fact that our attention spans are diminishing. And I really think that listening to jazz actively can be such a good brain workout. So maybe this week, try and do that. Listen to some jazz, a few tracks, maybe even a whole album. That's a real challenge. Work yourself through it and really see how your attention shifts. Pay attention to what you're hearing. Your brain is constantly trying to predict what's coming next and responding to surprise, just like we talked about with improvisation. And over time, this kind of mental exercise can improve your ability to shift between tasks and recognize patterns and just stay mentally agile. It's like a workout for your brain, but a very pleasurable one. You're activating the auditory cortex, you're engaging your memory networks, and even parts of the brain involved in motor planning as we subconsciously anticipate these rhythms and movements. So definitely keep that in mind. But jazz isn't just mentally stimulating, it's also so emotionally rich. Slow, mellow jazz, for instance, has been shown to reduce stress, lower heart rate, and promote relaxation. Your brain responds to the ebb and flow of melody and rhythm, helping you to process emotions in a non-verbal way. But it could also be incredibly adaptive as well. Listening to a lively, upbeat piece can elevate your mood, while a more reflective or melancholic blues track can help you process sadness or tension. And in this way, jazz acts as a great tool for emotional regulation, giving your mind a way to match or gently shift your emotional state. And studies show that this active emotional engagement really enhances mood overall, supports mindfulness, and can even reduce anxiety. So, in a very real sense, jazz can be like therapy for the mind and the body. Now, it can also give you a creativity boost. Exposure to jazz improvisation encourages flexible thinking. So, when you listen to a musician navigating unexpected chord changes or inventing melodies on the spot, even though you're not actively playing the instrument, it primes your own brain for novelty. And research suggests that engaging with improvisational music can help people break through rigid thought patterns, generate new ideas, and also approach problems more creatively. There is research actually that shows if you're about to engage in creative thinking or do a certain task, it might actually help you to loosen up by listening to some jazz music. Maybe try that out and let me know if you come up with better ideas after listening to jazz. But it's not just about being inspired. It's even just hearing the interplay of structure and freedom in jazz just teaches your brain overall that there is room to explore and experiment. And these are skills that can directly translate to problem solving, brainstorming, or just creative work in general. And interestingly, listening to instrumental jazz can also help you enter a mild flow state, similar to what musicians experience while playing. So, without having distracting lyrics, instrumental jazz provides a gentle cognitive stimulation that can actually enhance focus, making it ideal for deep work or studying, for example. Now, research on background music does suggest that complex, non-verbal music like jazz engages the brain just enough to maintain alertness and interest without overwhelming your cognitive resources. So essentially, it's a sweet spot. Your mind stays active, attentive, and relaxed all at once. But finally, jazz connects listeners to something bigger than themselves. Every improvisation carries with it layers of history, culture, and shared musical language. By listening, you're engaging with a tradition that spans generations, from New Orleans street bands to modern jazz ensembles, and tapping into a conversation that really transcends words. And this cultural immersion can help to foster empathy, social awareness, and appreciation for musical dialogue. It's a way of participating in a rich, living art form, even as a listener, learning to anticipate, respond, and emotionally connect, much like the listeners themselves. So, whether you're sitting quietly at home, working at your desk, or even just commuting, jazz really offers more than just entertainment. It helps to keep your brain sharp, helps regulate your emotions, spark creativity, support focus, and just connects you to a vibrant cultural lineage. So, it's an active engagement with your mind, your emotions, and the world around you. And that is a wrap on today's deep dive into the fascinating world of jazz. I hope that you're walking away from this episode with a new appreciation for jazz music, not just as music, but as a living conversation, a playground for the brain, and as a tool for expression and connection. So next time you listen to a jazz track, try noticing how it engages your attention, challenges your predictions, and moves your emotions in different ways. And maybe that's it. Try to listen to more jazz this week and see what it does for you. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music or jazz music just as much as you do, or might just find it interesting. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And also come and say hi over on Instagram and Threads at the Soundmind Talks. I love chatting with you all about the episodes and just hearing what you're listening to. So yeah, send me your favorite jazz tracks over there. I would absolutely love to hear them. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on the Sound Mind.